my name's Robert Garber, I'm Seven-More Investors, and been an early stage investor for over 25 years now, and meet with about 2,000 or 3,000 companies a year. And so I may know a thing or two about compelling pitches and stories. And I think this is a very under emphasized component of being an entrepreneur and being a CEO, being a founder, even being a commercial sales leader. I think it's all about storytelling. And if we look across our portfolio, there's a real difference between those who are really good storytellers and those who aren't. And it has a pretty big impact on commercial success, on business success. So I just want to talk a little bit about, and I know we have a short period of time, so I'll flow through this if you guys can get your slides. Talking a little bit about techniques, a little bit about how you structure a narrative, authenticity, which I think is a highly underutilized word. Especially in healthcare, it's about the mission. And I guarantee you that, there are easier ways to make a buck than doing healthcare startups or even healthcare venture. I call this all the get rich slow business. And so you got to really want to do it. And then lastly, a little bit on best practices. So not surprisingly, one of the best storytellers in the world, Steve Jobs, and he was, a visionary when it came to talking about what the future could be, not just for product design, but sort of how we leverage technology in our day-to-day life. And not surprisingly, and the gentleman who introduced me said this, look, people make decisions for emotional reasons. Then they look for the fact patterns to back them up. It's not the other way around. We all have that experience in our lives. We think about something, we have an emotional hook, and then we're like, I need this, I need that, I want to go here, I saw a picture of this, I want to visit that country, whatever it may be. It's all around tying to the emotion. And another way I could have, presented this deck was like, not just the art and science of storytelling, but how to get and keep an investor's attention. That's the other way this is. And I think there's got to be a little bit more intentionality about it. So I encourage people to be really intentional about their storytelling and think about what's the narrative you want to tell. And we'll walk through a couple of different ideas, but there are a number of different types of stories you can tell. And there's quite a bit of research around this. If you want to dig around, there are a number of books and there's quite a bit of science around how to tell stories and how to build and architect your pitch for maximum impact. But there are a lot of different stories about the who, what, why I'm here, moral stories, teaching stories, personal experience stories. I know what you're thinking stories, which is validating. And as you think about this, we'll talk a little bit later, it's important to understand who your audience is as to how you tell your narrative. And then once you sort of have the why, then the how, right? Is there are a lot of different types of techniques that you can use around, whether it be a cultural tie-in or curiosity, humor, if you're really, really bold and you think you can land it. That tends not to go well, but, have at it. Show, don't tell. I think people process things in a visual way. And so nobody wants to be spoken to for 30 minutes, right? You want to be engaged. You want to have a discussion. You don't want to be talking at somebody. And again, as you think about this, think about who your primary audience is going to be and whether or not there are different ways that you should be incorporating one or more of these techniques. And so when you think about the narrative, there's actually an arc, right? There's and there's three different arcs here that are going to overlap. One is sort of the story arc, which is sort of how you set the stage, create some conflict or talk about what the problem is that you're running into. And then sort of you're going to peak at the climax here in the story, and you're going to say, here's the aha moment, right? And then the resolution is sort of the next steps, right? So, there is a business arc of the story, which is sort of setting all the factual background, right? So this is sort of not the emotional part. This is sort of the business arc, which is start with the context, what's the background, why should the investor care, talk about some of the problems, the opportunities, market sizing, as I said, the aha moment, like what's the breakthrough, like why this, why now, and why us, right? Those are always the questions that we're asking is like, there are plenty of problems to solve out there. There are plenty of really smart people. In our roles, we're always trying to say, okay, well, why these guys and why is the timing right? Is the market right? And is this a good bet? And then lastly, sort of what's the call to action, right? Next steps. The emotional arc sort of overlies with this, and this is where you think about how do you want the audience to feel as you're telling this story, right? Curious, engaged, empathetic, amused, maybe, frustrated, shared sense of pain. And ultimately, if you're telling the story right, they get excited and energized by what you're doing, right? They say, wow, this is really different. This is unique. You can really make a difference. And I would argue nobody else is in this room if they weren't thinking about trying to make a difference in somebody's life, some way, somehow. And then lastly, like to create some hope and motivation, right? You want people to feel inspired and say, I want to go on this journey with you, because trust me, it is a journey. So how do you think about making it genuine, right? So, and this is, how do I say it? Do this with a dose, not, with like an eyedropper, not a turkey baster, right? So like, you don't want to spend a half an hour talking about your personal story, but you do need to talk about why something is meaningful and personal. What's the mission? And nothing hits home more than an authentic story about why you're doing this. And not to be blinded by I had a personal experience, because I think everybody in here has had some negative experience in the healthcare system. But the question is, how do you extrapolate from that into a much larger problem? Right? So one of the biggest mistakes people have when they're trying to create authenticity is focusing on something that's really, really narrow and expecting that to extrapolate to a really big market opportunity. Could be a rare disease, which is very impactful for someone, but also might be a very small market. Versus anybody in this room who has a loved one going through Alzheimer's and dementia, that's a pretty universal problem and only getting worse. And so, we've seen 30 or 40 companies in that market in the last few months, because everybody, once they get to our age, has a loved one or a friend of a loved one or somebody who's going through this journey. And then lastly, like, nothing is telling the story as effectively as bringing around like-minded people and being able to demonstrate your ability to attract that talent, right? Your storytelling isn't just to me as the investor. Your storytelling is to the first hires, your co-founders, your initial, leaders on the team who are going to go out there and believe the mission and try and sell it. And so that storytelling resonates throughout all of your audience. So it's not just going to be the investors, not just going to be employees, but it's also going to be your customers that you try and get them to take a risk on you and your story. And then sort of connect the dots, right? So you have to connect a personal story to the market opportunity and to the data, and then trying to demonstrate how this becomes a business, right? Because at the end of the day, these are businesses, and we're in the, I would say, like, if you ask me what I'm doing, I'm trying to make people's lives better. But if I don't provide my own investors a return, that doesn't allow me to keep doing what I do. And so it's important to say, okay, now I can translate my personal experience or my vision story to what the economic argument and why somebody might be interested in investing, in working for me, or buying my product. So lastly, let me wrap up with a couple of best practices. One, know your audience, right? And be specific about it. So I'll give you an example. We have a company in the GI space, and they were talking to a co-investor, and noticed in the background that the co-investor was on the board of one of the national associations around GI health and Crohn's and colitis. But that's a pretty relevant fact as you're going to talk to somebody about a GI business that, by the way, this person has a really relevant background, probably has a lot of family history or personal history in it, and A, knows the market, so you don't have to spend a lot of time telling them about the market, but B, has a predetermined interest. It sounds really basic. You'd be surprised at how little I find entrepreneurs do their homework and target their pitches to particular investors, especially, not in the deck, but especially face to face. You don't want to spend a half a pitch trying to talk about a market when somebody you're talking to already knows the market, for example. Two, we talked about the authentic. Authenticity comes in both success and failures. I think a good question to be able to answer is like, what have you learned along the way, good and bad? And so, you have to, nobody gets it right. And if you think you act like you know everything, that's incredibly, I would say, It's a yellow flag. We'll put it that way. Right. We'll put it that way. I always say one of the most terrifying things to me are people who don't know what they don't know. And if I've been burned by something over the years of doing this, that's been right up there in the things that I've had to deal with. And so being authentic, being self-aware, acknowledging what has gone right, hasn't gone right is important. Be concise and linear, a dozen slides, 10 to 12 minutes. If it takes you more than 10 to 12 minutes to tell your story, you don't know your story, right? You just don't. The more complex the story, the harder it is to execute, the harder it is to understand. Those are all red flags. Practice your pitch in front of a mirror. Tell it to somebody who doesn't know your business. Talk to people who are or not healthcare experts. We live in a bubble where we all understand these terms, and but most people don't. Don't jump around a lot. I know some of this will just get very basic, but you'd be surprised. In 10 or 12 minutes, two presenters max. If you're handing it around, 3 people on your team is disjointed, it's hard to follow, you lose the narrative. When I first learned venture back in the 90s, somebody presented to me with the 5 M's, which I always think is a really good heuristic to use. Make sure in your slides you cover the market, the method, which is the how or the what, the metrics, particularly unit economics really matter, the team, and money, which is sort of how you make money and what's the money you need to make the business successful. And I know it seems kind of basic. Don't forget the ask. I end 90% of my pitches and there's no ask and no follow-up. You'd be shocked. No emails following up on a discussion. No second email. I get, 500 emails a day. It's not that I'm not interested. It just gets buried. And so you'd be surprised at how poor people are at follow-up. Be follow-up. Ask if they need more information. If somebody requests more information, be responsive to it. But make sure in the pitch you have an ask. I know it seems kind of basic, but I see these problems happen over and over again. So I hope this gives you a little bit of guidance on storytelling. I'd encourage you all to spend time with the narrative, telling it, practicing it, making it second nature, because it really does matter. I think if you've done your job successfully telling the story, for a fishing metaphor, you've set the hook, right? You haven't caught the fish, but you've got the investor interested in coming back and learning more. And in your first meeting, that's all you're trying to do is get somebody to want to learn more, right? You're not going to write a check after that first meeting. You just want to take another meeting and want to learn more. So thanks for your time today. I appreciate it.